So as everyone knows, we had a pretty epically horrendous year this past year with red tide and harmful algae blooms. And so Dr. Brand is here with the University of Miami to talk about some of his research on the subject.
Jennifer sort of changed my talk, rearranged the slides at the last minute, so we'll see how this goes here. Okay, well.
We did
so
that.
the purpose, I'm sorry, this is my responsibility.
Yeah.
So, we wanted to brief the policy committee on recent harmful algae bloom research, and I just point out in your packet, there are 2 different journal articles that Dr. Brand authored, that one speaking to red tide, Perennia brevis, and one to cyanobacteria. So those are backup materials that you can feel free to look at. But we thought it'd be great for you to have an opportunity to hear from him directly. And after we adjourn today's meeting, he'll be around so that you guys can one-on-one go up and talk with him and ask any questions that you have.
That's just the papers. Okay, everyone already knows that the 2 nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, are major sources of these harmful algal blooms. That's what drives them. And, most of these nutrients typically come from sewage, agricultural runoff, that kind of thing. But we have some other things here in Florida that modify this picture here. First of all, Florida itself is a large limestone platform, and we know chemically limestone sucks up the phosphorus. So we normally think of South Florida being a phosphorus-limited ecosystem. Certainly the Everglades are, Biscayne Bay is. And that's why the whole Everglades restoration plan was aimed at reducing the phosphorus going into the Everglades. Okay. There's other things going on as well. I'll just skip that slide. That just shows the original watershed of South Florida over on the east side here. The Kissimmee River Basin flowing into Lake Okeechobee and then flowing down all the way down to Florida Bay. The red here is a ridge, and over here again, so you've got this trough in the middle. That's why you have water, at least initially it went north to south as opposed to flowing to the east. They got modified. Okay, as you already know here, one of the things that changes all this is we also have natural phosphate deposits over here at the surface just east of Tampa Bay here, and so that shifts the west coast from a phosphorus-limited ecosystem to a nitrogen-limited ecosystem. You already have natural amounts of phosphorus in excess. So while the Everglades restoration plan is focused on reducing phosphorus, on the west coast you need to reduce nitrogen. That's a very important point because a lot of times people ignore that.
Can we interrupt you on
It's fine. I'm okay with it.
You said nitrogen was in excess in Florida naturally?
No, the phosphorus is in it. Well, both. I want to show you that you have excess nitrogen in certain places and excess phosphorus. So that there is excess phosphorus. That's natural phosphate deposits, which are being mined today. So when you have excess phosphorus, adding more phosphorus is not going to increase your algal blooms. If you add more nitrogen, that will increase your algal blooms. So nitrogen is the problem you need to focus in on the west coast. Okay, and as you already know, initially the Caloosahatchee River was not connected to the lake in a substantial amount, so it had a separate watershed. So again, the blue was the original watershed of the Caloosahatchee River, which I gather you're now adding in to your program here. But because humans did connect that, now you have to add in the red area. In other words, you had the Kissimmee River Basin, at least you had a lot of wetlands in that area, which got drained for, now you have dairy farms, cattle ranches, citrus, and so on. Wetlands naturally suck up nutrients. When you drain that land, it turns it into a nutrient source rather than a nutrient sink. And then the northern third of the Everglades was also drained, turned into what's called the Everglades agricultural area. Because of back pumping, that becomes part of the watershed of the Caloosahatchee River as well. And again, that was a wetlands that would normally be a nutrient sink. Now you have largely sugarcane farms, which is now a nutrient source. Okay, remember that previous slide, you saw those red ridges. So you have this trough here, okay? And so as we came out of this ice age, about 5,000 years ago, that trough started filling up with water, okay? And that's what generates the Everglades. As you fill up this trough here, and you have vegetation from the wetlands sinking, you store up all that organic peat, and it's very rich in nitrogen, extremely rich in nitrogen. And you filled up this whole trough with this organic peat. That's why the farmers love that soil, because they don't have to spend any money on nitrogen fertilizer. It's already there. The problem is, as long as it's underwater, it remains trapped. As soon as you drain the Everglades for agricultural land, you destroy that Everglades peat and you release that nitrogen. That's what's happened. In the Everglades system, what's happened then is you've essentially released 5,000 years worth of nitrogen in the last 50 to 100 years. This leads to also called subsidence. When you expose that organic peat to the air, essentially organic peat just goes to CO2 and you release that nitrogen and the land subsides. So 1924, that was the surface of this land here in this area, Algal, and then whenever this photo was taken, that's the land surface there. You've lost many, many feet of organic peat, and all that nitrogen then has run downstream, down the CHNEP River, down the Florida Bay, and so on. So bottom line is the Everglades, blue indicates a phosphorus-limited ecosystem, red indicates a nitrogen-limited ecosystem. So the Everglades, Biscayne Bay, and eastern Florida Bay are a phosphorus-limited ecosystem. But as you shift over to western Florida Bay and all along the west coast, it's a nitrogen-limited ecosystem. That's really important to know what the limiting nutrient is, which nutrient is going to cause the problems for you. So here you need to be focused more on nitrogen. And that's just my sampling program. We'll skip that, and I'll skip that. So again, go back to what I said at the beginning. To feed 7.5 billion people on the planet, you need nitrogen and phosphorus in roughly a 16-to-1 ratio for fertilizer to grow plants. Fertilization is not 100% efficient, so some of that agricultural fertilizer runs off into your local waters, creating algal blooms. To the extent that the nutrients go into plants, we eat it, we generate sewage, and again, when the sewage goes downstream and your water bodies can generate algal blooms. So this is a global problem. It's nothing unique to Florida. With 7.5 billion people, there's a lot of fertilizer, a lot of sewage, and we're seeing increasing harmful algal blooms around the world. Okay. The point here is, typically when you have fertilizer runoff and sewage runoff, you see nitrogen and phosphorus in roughly a 16-to-1 ratio. But in Florida, on the west coast, you have those natural phosphate deposits. That gives you additional phosphorus, and you alter that ratio. Similarly, downstream of the Everglades, where you're destroying that organic peat, now you have excess nitrogen, and that alters the ratio the opposite direction. So that's why you see this east-west difference in terms of what the limiting nutrient is in Florida. Okay, well, every time I do a cruise along the west coast of Florida, I always see higher abundance of algae near the mouth of the CHNEP River. Same thing there. Okay, and here, sampling program in Estero Bay, Charlotte Harbor, Pine Island Sound, and so on. This is during the dry season when there's very little land runoff, and this is during the wet season. My color scheme is blue is low abundance of algae, red is high abundance of algae. So basically, this just shows that suggesting that land runoff of nutrients is a major source of driving these algal blooms. And ignore the bottom slide here, the top slide here. It's 5 years of data. This is flow down the river in blue, and then abundance of algae in green. This is in Charlotte Harbor. So you see very good correlation.
Question.
Now focus, yes.
In a non-developed state, if the whole state of Florida were not developed,
Right.
would you see those same variances in the wet season and dry season?
Be much, much smaller. Now you probably see a little bit, much less. But the other aspect, though, natural wetlands. Well, let me back up. Okay, let's take the Everglades. You hold those nutrients in, so even if the water's high during the wet season, you're still trapping those nutrients.
So in a
So you probably wouldn't see much. You probably see a little bit, but not very much flowing downstream. The problem is, you used to have a lot of wetlands throughout our throughout Florida, and so that tends to trap all the nutrients. So, I mean, unfortunately, I don't have any data from 100 years ago, so I can't say for sure, but it'd be very, very tiny if there was some. Certain places where you have more bare soil, then even under natural conditions during the wet season, you know, erosion of soil, you're going to generate, you know, a little bit of algal bloom downstream, but it's much, much higher today because of all these additional.
So the fluctuation is due to alterations.
Right.
Okay.
You generate these nutrients on the land, and then you're flushing them downstream during the wet season. Okay, let's first look at the freshwater. This is the Clusatch River. These are blooms of cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. That's just a close-up I took. If you've seen that, you know it smells absolutely awful. Okay. Well, these blue-green algae are known to produce a number of different toxins. The one that people are most familiar with is microcystin here. That's the toxin there. This was first discovered like 100 years ago over in Australia when a bunch of sheep died. Okay, and that's how we discover almost all the algal toxins we know about. A bunch of people or a bunch of sheep or other animals die or get very sick or something at a given time and location. In this case, these sheep were drinking from the pond over here and it had a big bloom of algae. Scientists go in and they find out what's being produced by these algae and make it toxic, and that's how this toxin was discovered. And since then, you know, in many cases, you know, people dying, animals dying, and so on, and short-term gastrointestinal disorders, and so on. Well, once scientists started studying the biochemical mechanism of this toxin, okay, they discovered it can also lead to long-term liver damage. It's a tumor-promoting, lead to liver cancer, and so on. Okay, suppose microcystin did not cause any immediate effects, did not make people sick, or did not lead to death, only led to cancer, things like that, long term. In other words, you don't see a health effect until 10 or 20 years later. Okay, we would have never discovered that toxin. Okay, just because by then people moved around, animals moved around, they're dying at different times, places, and so on. It's very hard to discover a toxin like that. Okay, recently we've discovered a toxin that appears to have that, and it's not shown here, but basically it's called BMAA. Okay, has no short-term effects and so on, but we have good evidence now it can lead to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. I'm not sure. Let's see. Yeah, okay. This was initially sort of discovered after World War II when you saw a 100-fold increase in the incidence of these neurodegenerative diseases among the native Chamorro people of Guam. It took many decades of research to figure out what was going on. Okay, but anyway, the bottom line is because of an alteration of their food chain during World War II. Anyway, the bottom line is if you look at the brain tissue of these people, of the Chamorro people, you see high levels of BMA in their brains. Okay, look at these are Canadian controls. People died of something else, no BMAA. Here's two Canadians who died of Alzheimer's, and you see BMA in their brain. So that led me to think, well, it's not just this really unusual food chain in Guam. There could be other sources. We know the BMA is coming from these blue-green algae. We've got blooms here in South Florida. So I started looking at food chains here in South Florida. We've documented high levels of BMA in Americans as well, who are obviously not eating this unusual food chain in Guam. Bottom line is you do have high concentrations of BMA. This is a bunch of fish that John Cassani gave me from the Clusatch River. Okay, very high levels here. Somewhat similar to the food that people of Guam are eating. I've seen even higher concentrations of shrimp and crabs in other water bodies here in South Florida. Okay, that's just showing high abundance of blue-green algae down the Clusatch River here. Okay, now shift over to red tide. That's the organism that produces it, Cornea brevis. And of course, it kills lots of organisms, just sea turtles here. Okay, I took 50 years worth of data, just sort of did a statistical average. Where do you tend to find red tide? Now, at any given time, it doesn't look like this, but just on an average. The hot spot is basically on the coastline from Tampa Bay down to about Naples. Okay? and inshore. Here's a transect from the shoreline going offshore. Blue is salinity. So salinity goes down as you get to the coastline because of fresh water coming in. And then average abundance of red tide is much, much higher inshore. Again, that suggests the nutrients in the land runoff of fresh water is leading to higher abundance of the red tide. Okay, now the red tide is natural. We know 500 years ago there was red tide. Spanish explorers documented this and so on. But what I'm looking at here, looking at the database, here's the transect going from the shoreline going offshore. The blue line is what it looks like 50 years ago. The red line is what it looks like today. It's on average about 15 times more abundant than it was 50 years ago. Let's see. So, okay, so bottom line is, just take this area here, on average 15 times more red tide today than it used to be. You look at the densest blooms. How dense can it get? 50 years ago, it was on the order of 2.5 million cells per liter, and now it's on the order of 35. To get 15 times more algae, you need 15 times more nutrients. And I can't think of any natural sources of nutrients that have increased 15-fold over the last 50 years. What has obviously increased dramatically over the last 50 years is the number of people and associated activities, agriculture, sewage, etc. So yes, red tide is natural, but I would argue that we've made it much, much worse.
What data sources did you have 50 years
Excuse
ago?
me?
What data sources did you
This is the state. Because what happens is state monitors red tide, because when you have a red tide, the shellfish become toxic, and so they shut down the shellfish harvesting during this. So they have a pretty good monitoring program. And so they have a very large database going back to 1954.
So you've ruled out sampling bias?
Well, no, there is well, if you read the paper, I mean, there is sampling bias. It's not a perfect data set, okay? But if you read my paper, we do go into how we reduce that sampling bias. So I'm convinced this is real. I mean, if there was a twofold difference, I would say that's probably within the margin of error, but 15-fold, I don't see how sampling bias could have generated such a large difference. Okay, I think I'm going to end with this. I'm just going to show you a sequence. I can show you a bunch of sequences. I'll just show you one. What this is, black dot is where a sample was taken, and you'll see how sporadic the sampling is going from month by month. These dots will be in different places, okay? There's a lot of opportunistic sampling. But black dots mean the sample is taken, there is no red tide, and the larger the red dot here, the higher abundance of red tide. And then on the CHNEP River and Peace River tells you how much water is coming down the river. So we're going to start out here, I guess that's toward the end of the dry season. You go the months before, that was dry season, you see no red tide. And now you come into the wet season, June, you see a little bit of red tide near the mouth of CHNEP River. And just we'll go month by month here, and you see how the coastal currents are expanding it as you dump more nutrients in during the wet season. Okay, effects of red tide. Okay, well, this usually had the name neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. Okay, that's very rare now because, again, the state does a good job of monitoring for red tide, and they shut down shellfish harvesting when it's present. Okay, interesting enough, however, if you look at the hospital records during times of red tide, you see about a 40% increase of people coming down with gastrointestinal disorders. Okay, I don't have time to talk about it here. If it's interested, I can tell you what I think might be going on with that. Okay, the main effect today is that this toxin gets into the air as an aerosol, irritates your eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. I'm sure many of you experienced this already. Okay, and again, if you look at the hospital records, you see about a 50% increase in people going to the hospital for respiratory distress during times of red tide. That's it.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Questions. Has there been scientific confirmation of the effect of the blue-green algae time when it hits the salt water feeding red tide? And the second one is, what's the effect of the Mississippi River on the Gulf of Mexico? Do you know that?
Okay, yeah, what happened this past summer is you have the blue-green algae in Lake Okeechobee and then coming down the Coosahatchee River, and they get flushed all the way out. I mean, people told me they actually saw it out on the beaches itself. Now, that's a freshwater algae. Eventually, it's going to die and decompose and release those nutrients.
Right.
Now, that particular species is it's a large colonial one that's enveloped in this gelatinous matrix. So it dies fairly slowly when it hits seawater because initially it's sort of protected by that mass. But eventually it is going to die. It's going to release those nutrients, along with all those residual nutrients in the Coosahatchee River. Now, I know there's been a little bit of confusion because there is a paper talking about the red tide organism, Corinna brevis, eating cyanobacteria, a blue-green algae. That's a different species. It eats this microscopic marine species, which is like 1 micron in size, smaller than the red tide organism, so it can eat that. But the blue-green algae in the Lake Okeechobee and Coosahatchee River is a very large colonial one, actually much larger than the Corinna brevis, so it can't eat that.
Okay, so it's not making red tide worse.
Well, it is. It's not specifically. The blue-green algae itself is not making red tide worse, but it's not because the red tide's not eating that blue-green algae. But the blue-green algae is a symptom of extremely high levels of nutrients. So when you dump those blue-green algae into the ocean, eventually they do die. They release those nutrients again,
Right.
and that, of course, then feeds the red tide.
Okay, that's.
And again, you saw that this summer because you had that red tide ever since the previous October after Hurricane Irma, sort of low levels or moderate levels.
Mm-hmm.
But then in May we had really extreme rainfall, and so the Army Corps of Engineers had no choice but to release that water down the Coosahatchee River. And I guess, well, you had Lake Okeechobee already covered with, 90% covered with blue-green algae. When they released that water in June, I think it was, when that water went out into the Gulf, that's exactly when you saw the red tide get worse, and that's when you start seeing the massive fish kills and all the other things, manatees, dolphins, everything dying, and that's when you had all the news headlines and so on. Yeah. Yes.
Excellent presentation. Are you able to share your slideshow with this board?
Sure.
That would be wonderful. And as a commissioner for Manatee County, I mean, everything that I've read is that, as you said, agriculture and urbanized population are the major contributors to red tide and what we're seeing. But it is such a difficult topic to understand and very emotional. And the public often jumps to mosaic and phosphate mining. We still have Mosaic representative here? And so could you talk just a little bit about that from a scientific?
Okay, two things I'll mention. First of all, remember I said on the West Coast, you're nitrogen limited.
Yeah.
Mosaic is mining phosphate. So to the extent they're releasing phosphate, that's not the major issue.
And we're not releasing phosphate either.
Excuse me?
We're mining the phosphate, we're not.
Well, okay. Well, I imagine you must be releasing some. I mean,
Well, it's actually, when we're mining it, it is not, it goes to the manufacturing plants to make the
yeah,
fertilizer.
no, I realize that, yeah. The other aspect of it is, actually, I first started on harmful algal blooms referring to the blue-green algae blooms down in Florida Bay. And there's high phosphorus in western Florida Bay, and I was wondering what the source of that was. And so, in fact, one of the first hypotheses I had was the mining operations. But when I looked at the data, I looked at phosphate concentrations coming down the Peace River, and I can't remember the exact dates from like the 1950s or whatever to around 2000 or around 1996 when I looked at the data, phosphate concentrations went down. At the same time, the algal blooms in Florida Bay were going up. I'm coming to the conclusion what it was. I think initially the mining operations were pretty sloppy, but in the 60s, when environmental regulations came in, the regulations forced them to release less and less, and so you see the phosphate concentrations coming down the Peace River go down.
That's an excellent point, because, we've been mining in a Peace River basin for over 100 years. At that time, there was 30 plus mining companies. Now it is just us, and the strictest environmental regulations to date. And now there's high concentrations of red tide and algal blooms, and we're mining less and have stricter environmental regulations. And we've looked, and as far as we're aware, there are no scientific data to date to prove that phosphate mining has any way contributing to the phenomenon that's going on.
Yes.
I'm from Cape Coral, so blue-green algae was a big issue last year. Can you talk to me about where the scientific community is on air quality testing?
Yeah.
I know that's a big issue, especially with blue-green algae. 'Cause it's kind of-
Right, yeah, we actually, I'm working with an atmospheric chemist right now, because, with respect to the red tide, we know that toxin, the brevetoxin, gets into the air, affects people's health. With the blue-green algae, with the microcystin, the BMA produced by the blue-green algae, so far all of our data is on what's in the water and the seafood, and we know that's an issue. What we don't know is to what extent those toxins get into the air. So I'm working with an atmospheric chemist right now. We actually sampled the Cape Coral area, right next to those canals. And you had all those canals just chock full of these blue-green algae blooms. So we did sample, and we've got a problem right now in that the person who's doing the toxin analysis, she's had some problems the last few months. So we have all these frozen samples. We actually haven't analyzed the samples yet. So, but that's definitely on the radar. That's actually one of my top issues right now in terms of my own research, is to what extent these toxins are getting in the air. I mean, I've got lots of data on toxins in seafood. You know, I guess, my view is, when you look at that bloom in Clusatch River, I mean, hopefully people know not to go swimming in that water or don't eat the fish from that river and so on. But if you're living in Cape Coral, you have no choice but to breathe the air there. That's my concern right now.
That's very good to hear. Thank
So,
you.
but we don't know. But it's not just me. Also, I know people at FGCU is looking at this issue, and some people over at the University of Florida. So, there's a lot of research being done on that right now. We just don't have results, or really good results yet.
Thank you.
I mean, you're a walking encyclopedia. This is great for me. And I know so little, so I'm so easily impressed. But right now, you have really laid it on me. And I'm a Florida native, and I live on the Clusatch, so I follow this very closely. But you are a wealth of information for me. Thank you very much. I want you to follow up on Commissioner Truex's question earlier, which has troubled me my whole life. The Mississippi River.
Oh, right. That was the other question you had. Yes. Okay.
It drains the heartland of America.
Oh, yeah.
And all that farmland.
Yes.
And why aren't we seeing disaster after disaster at the Delta?
Well, you do. I mean, at the mouth of the Delta, you have what we call a dead zone. It's, I think it fluctuates between 5,000 and 8,000 square miles, if my number's correct. It's larger than some states. It's a huge area that goes completely anaerobic.
Why doesn't somebody care about that?
They do. It just doesn't make the news, I guess, but no. It's a huge issue for many years.
Can we blame them for part of our problem?
No, for the most part, the Mississippi River, when it hits the coast, usually it carries, that water then, the plume goes toward the west, over toward Louisiana and Texas coast. So that's, if you look at a map of that dead zone, it's over to, mostly to the west of the plume, of the delta there. Now, on occasion,
TV shows of the richest commercial fishing all around the mouth of the river, in the Delta area, recreational and commercial. And I'm missing something here.
well, it depends on, to the east or west, or, depends on where you look exactly, but there's another issue here, and that is, I don't know too much about it, but my understanding is the fishermen kind of like the dead zone, because what happens is, when you create, it usually gets created every summer, okay? And when you do that, the fish and so on know to get out of that water, so you tend to concentrate the fish near the edge of the dead zone, okay? And they're moving out, they're trying to get out away from the dead zone, and so you're taking all these fish from like a 5,000 to 8,000 square mile area, and you're pushing them out to the edges, so you're concentrating all the fish right there along the edge of it, and so the fishermen know that's where you're going to find the high fish. Because that might be part of it.
Can you go back to your red bar graph? It's only 4 or 5 back, and you were showing one more where you had the thermometer. Yeah. And just on top of that, you've got, from Lee County up past Manatee or what, near Tampa.
Yeah, well, I'm taking the data from just this area here. This is sort of the hot spot. And I'm taking data from there, and I take the average. I take the average of all the data from this time period here, and that's in blue. And I take the average of all the data in this area during this time period here, and that's the red. And that's the average abundance of red tide.
Is it oversimplifying, a conclusion to suggest that it's much heavier at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee? Because indeed, the general public is of the opinion, I believe, that it's the Caloosahatchee, including the Kissimmee River and the farmers, and we're largely responsible. But when I look at your charts, they spread all up and down.
Right, because, yeah, the
And it's
Caloosahatchee,
just as bad north of
Oh, yes.
Caloosahatchee.
yes, because you've dumped the nutrients in here, but then you have these coastal currents that carry it around. Okay, and I could show you I have other time courses here, but basically, the water that comes out the mountain, it doesn't just sit there. The coastal currents are carrying it up,
So
sometimes
you're-
up north, sometimes to the south. And so
You're
on.
confirming the general public's understanding that the Caloosahatchee still is a major source.
Yes.
Yes.
And again, because, it's not the only source.
That are feeding red tide.
Let's see, I can't remember which way. Was it back this way? No, I guess, well, the watershed, remember, I had the picture of the watershed, the blue area, and then the red area. The watershed of the Caloosahatchee River now is 4 times larger than it used to be. That's a huge watershed, all dumping all those nutrients from the sugarcane fields, the dairy farms, the cattle ranches, citrus, all that's going to the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River. That is,
Plus urbanization.
plus urban areas, yeah. All that is leading to that area. So, yeah, I mean, there's other rivers along the coastline, and they are contributing, but, the major contributor is Caloosahatchee River, just because that huge watershed.
Of land-based
occupies.
nutrients.
Right.
Is what you're talking
Yeah.
about. So I know that there's research that talks about recycled nutrients offshore that feeds blooms as well.
Yeah, people talking about upwelling from offshore and so on.
Right.
I'm rather skeptical of that, though.
Well, I do think though,
I mean, it does happen, but.
it's important to understand that nutrients are one of many contributing factors. Right? You have to have salinity, you have to have temperature. There are other factors that some of those outside of our control. I think what Dr. Brand's really hitting home is there's one of these contributing factors that is in our control, and then the investments that many of you are making into septic and sewer, into more water quality treatment projects, that those are well-placed investments, because that will ultimately, hopefully, reduce the severity of future bloom events. We know that we probably can't eliminate red tide because it's been around since the beginning of time, but the idea is, has it become more intense and severe due to land-based nutrients? And I know the Department of Environmental Protection, they recognize the Caloosahatchee for many years now as impaired and have a cleanup plan in place, a basin management action plan to try to reduce those nutrients. And we have projects going in like the C-43 reservoir. Now we'll have a water quality treatment component. So, all these things are coming together, pointing in the same direction, and we're all working in unison trying to attack this common issue. And it's coming from, the one trick though is that there's no, people want to finger point like that source or that source or that source, when really every single person at some level is a contributor, and so what we're trying to do, in this magazine and the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program, and we really try to explain that concept that, yes, nutrients do have an impact on the severity, frequency, and intensity of harmful algae blooms, but, we are all responsible for things that each of us can do, and it's coming from a variety. It's not just any one single source, and there are a number of different initiatives going on in every sector to address this problem. And then the things that we're doing that people don't even think about as ways of addressing this problem, which are more nature-based solutions. So as we talked about, wetlands naturally, trap nutrients. Well, creating seagrass beds, creating oyster reefs, those help to purify and trap the nutrients. So we're like pointing to all of the different projects that we're doing throughout this watershed to try to do these place-based solutions. And I think that that is really what we wanted Dr. Brand here today to kind of talk to you and reinforce to you that what each of you are doing to address nutrient pollution is worthwhile, and it will ultimately be part of the solution to getting us to better water quality. And that, you know, that's what we're hoping your takeaway is.
Jennifer, one, I'm with you, 100%.
Let me just point out real quick, if upwelling of offshore water was the major source of nutrients driving the red tide, then why is it the red tide on average is more abundant, dramatically more abundant inshore where you have more fresh water? Okay, so again, that right there suggests that getting most of the nutrients from the fresh water that's coming in, and that's what's, you know, causing your salinity to go down, because the nutrients in that fresh water.
And so you are doing continued research, and I know Mo is doing continued research, we're doing continued research, everybody out there is really focused on this issue, and there's going to be a lot of money invested in the next couple of years into doing extensive research. So we'll keep you updated as we keep getting more additional you know, emerging information on this topic, but we just wanted to bring you some information because we know this is a topic of concern.
Well,
given what we've been dealing with.
all you've done is pique my curiosity. Before you leave, tell me, explain one more time to me the 15 times more pollution that we have today than we did when the Spaniards were out there. What was that point? Make me understand that.
Well, it tells me that it's not, well, first of all, there's more red tide now, and the question is why? I can't think of any natural sources of nutrients that have increased 15-fold. So what's increased? We have to find a source that's increased 15-fold. Explain these data. And I can
The
only,
intensity of red
The
tide.
the density, the density.
What it used to be, density.
how dense it gets.
The concentration.
You have maybe just slightly green water, now you're really
500
green.
years ago, or 50 years.
50 years ago. I mean, we have data started in 1954. It's only in the early 50s that people even knew what the red tide organism was. Before that,
Just in this half century, we're.
Yeah.
right. Now, it might have been even lower before that. We have no data before 1954 because we didn't even know what caused the red tide. People before that, I mean, 500 years ago, the Native Americans, they knew not to eat the shellfish during the fall months, summer and fall months of the year. They didn't know why. They just knew they'd get very sick if they did. Okay, and you know, and then. And then later, you know, up to 100 years ago and so on, people knew about the red tide, but they had no idea what was causing all this fish. They just knew about the fish kills and, you know, the aerosol effects and so, but they didn't know what it was. It wasn't until the 1950s that people discovered it was this one particular species that produces this toxin, brevetoxin, that causes it all. So once you knew the species and you could identify it, now we have all the cell counts. So now we have water, you know, the state has a water sampling program. And we've got, well, more like 70 years worth of data now. So we can go back and look at that large data set and understand better what's going on.
So I know that Jennifer number 3 has a question. So we'll do one more question and then we'll just wrap up the meeting. And then I think Dr. Brand, hopefully you can stick around for a few more minutes. So if people have additional questions, please feel free.
Yeah, take advantage of the
Yeah.
meeting here.
So Jennifer number 3.
My question is related to this inverse relationship between moving onshore, Corynea brevis going up, salinity going down. Have there been laboratory studies that evaluate the viability and growth of Corynea brevis in low salinity conditions, independent of the nutrient pulse that would come with all that extra water? I mean, should we be looking at water quantity as well as quality?
Yeah, I mean, I could have another slide that would actually demonstrate this. Got taken out here. But for example, Corynea brevis is a marine species, and it is okay with low salinity down maybe around half strength salinity, 15 parts per thousand. So it doesn't live in fresh water. So a classic example of this is 2004 when you had 4 hurricanes hit Florida. Punta Gorda got hit with Charlie, and then you had 2 others in the watershed, the Peace River and Clusatch River. You had massive amounts of water coming down the Peace River and Clusatch River, massive amount of nutrients, okay? You look at the data, all that stuff comes down, you don't see a red tide, okay? And then you wait a couple of months, and finally you see a little bit of red tide. way down south. Well, you look at the satellite imagery and everything, all the data, it turns out there's so much fresh water coming, you turn that coastline into mostly fresh water, very, very low salinity, and Corynea brevis cannot live in that low salinity water. Where the blooms finally developed, you can look at the satellite imagery, you see this discolored water coming out of the Caloosahatchee River, and the initial blooms are at the edge of that plume where you got enough salt water mixing in with the nutrients from the fresh water. So you see the bloom developing right there at the interface of the river plume and the salt water. And then subsequently, that bloom, that ended up a 17-month red tide. It went from like December of 2004 to April 2006. Huge, probably one of the absolute worst red tides we've had in the state.
Clearly, K. brevis doesn't thrive in fresh water, but is there sort of a low salinity sweet spot between the Gulf salinity and the coastal estuary salinity?
I think it prefers full strength seawater, but it'll tolerate down to about half strength seawater. Yeah.
All right, so you can stick around a little bit longer, that'd be great. So we're just gonna wrap up the agenda here, and I'll see if we have any additional public comments from anybody. Jennifer, number 4, anything? Okay, I just wanted to get